Not yet, when I start.
Good morning. We'll start the video momentarily.
Hello everybody, it's with tremendous pleasure that I welcome you to our first virtual annual meeting 2020. I would like to first introduce myself, Amish Rao, immediate past president of GDN, a consultant with over 2 decades of experience working with institutions such as CDSL, a securities depository, worked on large-scale IT and organizational projects spanning both the public and private sectors. More recently, I had been working in the area of transforming the way Indian government delivers public services of providing academic awards electronically. Team GDN decided to create these webinars as a way to gather everyone virtually. These next few days are going to be all about us. More importantly, we'll spend valuable one-on-one time with each and every one of you so that you know your voice is not only being heard but valued. So why are we here in the first place? And I think the answer is, with people's experiences, distinction between real life and digital, that sort of melted away. Participants first focuses on the needs, being imaginative and visionary in terms of what we are actually going to be doing. The only way we are going to get there is by delivering that transformation in small sizes quickly. So, I would like to say we are a part of a worldwide digital movement. Over the next few days, hosting these webinars will help us hone in on the skills we have been interested in learning. Thank you so much for your time and commitment in joining us. Looking forward to seeing everyone out there in Ottawa, Canada next year for the GDN Annual Meeting 2021.
Good morning in Washington, D.C. Almost lunchtime here in Germany and in Europe, and good evening to Australia. This is our webinar on microcredentials for the Groningen Declaration Network. I'm very happy to moderate and host this meeting. My name is Michael. I'm the head of division for strategic planning at the German Academic Exchange Service. I won't say much about my organization. Some of you might know it as DAAD or DART. We support global mobility of young scholars, of more experienced researchers through scholarships, through project funding, but we also encourage internationalization of higher education in general and do marketing for Germany as a higher education and research destination. But that's not our topic today. Our topic today is microcredentials and the ecosystem that makes microcredentials work. This is also a topic that is of interest to an organization that cares for academic exchange, because in general, we would like to see learner mobility happen, and we would like to have a digital ecosystem and infrastructure in place that facilitates this at the national, regional, or global level. So we're definitely interested in what's happening around the globe on the topic of microcredentials, also for the perspective of possibly offering this type of badges or degrees to our own scholarship holders at some point in time. So that's some of the background I would like to give you why I'm so keen on moderating this session, and I'm happily doing so. But the main point of our session will be our 3 distinguished speakers covering exciting examples from Australia, South Africa, and the European Union. We thought there's so many developments happening around the globe on microcredentials, on its potential for learner mobility, on the question on who owns the right to the data that students produce or need for their own mobility, that this type of webinar made a lot of sense while we were planning it. And I would hope that after the introduction and the short presentations by our three speakers, we would have sufficient time for Q&A and for a discussion. We only have 1 hour in this webinar. Please write your questions into the Q&A chat or in the regular chat, but please do so while our speakers are doing their presentation, so that we can then, at the end of all presentations, cover that. Let me turn to Australia and to Beverly Oliver, who is a former Deputy Vice Chancellor for Education at Deakin University and currently working as a consultant and for a company called EduBrief. Beverly, would you like to start on your view on how microcredentials in Australia are currently functioning, on where they are heading, and maybe where some of the pitfalls and opportunities are? Beverly?
Thank you. I apologize. I didn't follow the first rule of Zoom, which is to unmute. Now, can I just check that my slides are working? Can you see my slides?
We can see your slides. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And I've asked Michael to give me a 10-minute warning once I get there. And there's an awful lot to say. So I hope you don't mind. I'm going to be a little bit skeletal and romp through this. But what I would like to do is let you know that I'll be drawing on these two reports. One I wrote, published last August 2019, on how to make micro-credentials work for learners, employers and providers. It does try to take a global view and some of Australia. And I've just released another one which you see on the right here, which is about Coursera professional certificates and Google career certificates. And I'm going to end by coming back to that. If you look on the top left-hand side of the screen, you can see a web address. Those reports are available there. So I'll leave you to look at it. I also intend to share the slides, so I hope that will help. Basically, I don't want to start with a cliche, but life has changed. And I think we're seeing a new mindset from 2020 onwards because of what we're all going through. I think we're moving from learning for more or less employability, which we've kind of been moving along that path for some time with more or less success, particularly in higher education now, to learning for earning. I think the questions that you see on the screen have changed order. I think the new order is, where will paid work be now? And I don't mean just for young people going off to higher education or having just left school. I mean across the lifespan. Secondly, which credential, short or long, is going to get me there via the fastest route? A lot of mature learners will now return to credentials, short or long, to help them secure, find, or create work for themselves. Less obvious now, and maybe a more prominent question previously, was how will this be funded and how will we measure success? I think success is going to be increasingly measured by the learners across the lifespan on whether this delivers the benefit I had in mind. And for many people, that will be paid work, not for everyone. So we're starting to see new questions asked about work, and it's important because I'm going to tie employment to education, and I'm going to talk about the ecosystem we need. This is just a snapshot from Australia, a government website, where we will start asking where work is plentiful, and this is currently what's plentiful, and I've deliberately pointed to ICT, and I'm going to come back to this at the end because that's one of the fields where you can take a short course to get ready to work in ICT. If you just look up the top of that picture, you'll see medical practitioners and nurses. You can't take a shortcut there. So I want to make the distinction that formal qualifications will still be required for many, many professions, but some, there will be short paths. We will also be asking though, where will it be safe to work? And this is the education and training industry, and who knew that we'd be thinking about primary school teachers who are the largest cohort who graduate from Australian universities, now wondering about how safe I am in my job. That's not quite something we expected. So what's been the Australian education policy response so far? Again, you can look at this later yourself. I will add some links. We've just been through legislation. It's in fact, still going through. The government wants to put through a job-ready graduates package, and you can see the focus on jobs, employment. And this has been coming for quite some time. Now, there's quite a bit in the package. I won't go through all of it, but I did want to point out a couple of things here. They want to make it easier for Australians to move between vocational and higher education. It's really quite bifurcated, and that would be a good thing if it were closer. Better recognition and greater uptake of micro-credentials. This government is very big on micro-credentials, even though they don't always quite understand them. I'll get onto that in a minute. We want to ensure qualifications incorporate the skills for job-ready graduates. Well, of course, and we've been doing that for a long time. And they've announced a national credentials platform, which I will talk a little bit about, but not much, for a very obvious reason. That is, we don't know much yet. So the Australian government has pledged $2.5 million to create some kind of national credentials platform. Here's the text from the media release. I'm reading between the lines, and there is no public information yet, but I'm sure it's coming, that with that small amount of money, I think this will be an addition to the My Equals system. Others would know more than I do, but I don't think it's going to be something quite massive. And massive, quite frankly, is what we in every nation and globally actually need. I'll come back to that in a minute, but what we have agreed on so far in Australia is what is a micro-credential. Now, the AQF is the Australian Qualifications Framework. There was a big review done last year. The review agreed with these definitions. In plain language, a micro-credential is a certification of assessed learning that's less than a formal qualification. More technical language is, and I'll admit to actually advising the panel and creating these definitions, so I'll explain why I did this. This is to line up with the ICED agreements with that UNESCO has helped us all agree to, that a micro-credential is a certification of assessed learning that is additional, alternative, complementary to, or a component part of a formal qualification. If you're interested in that, in the report I mentioned, Making Micro-Credentials Work, there's a detailed explanation of that and why I situated it there and where it sits in the definition. But more than that, the Australian government has also accepted this report that agreed on this definition when micro-credentials are credit-bearing. In other words, they lead to the offer of admission to or credit towards at least one formal qualification, then they must mirror and contribute the academic standards required. Now, we've got work to do to sort out exactly what this means, but the duration and effort should be in keeping with the amount of credit earned. The reason I put that there is because I was looking at micro masters courses on edX, and they give you 25% of credit towards an Australian masters, but they are considerably shorter and considerably cheaper than normally 25% of a master's degree. So I think that bears a little bit of looking at, not saying it's a bad thing. So basically, what these definitions say is what's not a micro-credential, learning or participation without assessment, and what's a formal qualification. So I'm just showing you some pictures here of what a bachelor and what a master degree looks like in my country. Each little blue box is a quarter of a full-time load in a semester. So the top 8 in a bachelor is a full first year, second year, third year, and you can see roughly the equivalent for a master. Now, the government's become very excited about what we should do because of COVID to add to these, because lots of people do bachelors. Not many Australians go on to masters. That's a problem, I think. We've always had a graduate certificate. It's on the AQF, but the government has announced that this is now a short course. It's a little confusing because it is a proper qualification in its own right. In the UK, that would be called a postgraduate certificate, I think. But it's also very affordable. So during COVID, they made these much cheaper for students to do. But here's another interesting move. They've also gone to universities and said, offer the first unit in a bachelor degree. We're going to call it a micro-credential. It's called an undergraduate certificate. It's a micro-credential because it's a component part. But then shortly afterwards, they said, actually, we've now added it to the AQF. So now officially, It's actually a qualification, no longer a micro-credential. So the government tends to use the word qualification, short courses, micro-credentials a little bit interchangeably. I don't blame them. This is pretty new. We're all still getting our heads around it. But I thought you might find that interesting. I think what we need is, and it's lovely that we're getting a national credentials platform, but I think we need learning for earning ecosystems. What do I mean by that? Well, we're learning from people around the world. I'm not going to talk about Europas. We've got Simone from Europe to tell us about things like that. But there is one example of a system I admire anyway. Here's another one, Singapore. Singapore has a skills framework and network where people can earn and bank credit. South Korea has an academic credit bank. If you haven't read this paper, I recommend it. This is on interoperable learning records from the United States. I think this is where things need to go, but I'm going to explain my concept a little more simply than that. I see these three groups as key stakeholders to make qualifications and work together. But I think there are 6 things any national system needs. You need granular skills information. You don't have that with degrees. You need credit to be bankable in this system. You need credentials to work together. I'll come back to that in a minute. People need money to incentivize them because nothing worse than having a platform that no one ever goes to. And you need people to be able to find work and work-related information, like career development learning, for example, like skills networks. How do I take my skills from here to there? I said I'd say a little bit more about credentials in this system. And I'm talking here micro and macro. Even some micro-credentials might be credit-bearing as well. Regardless, if you're 10 minutes?
Yes.
That went fast. Okay. Credentials, if you're a learner, you should be able to see what you've got. If you're a provider, what could you do? And if you're an employer, maybe I want to even offer some of my own. I'm going to go really quickly now, but there's a way of looking at micro-credentials. Again, this is in the report, and it's a bit of a taxonomy that you can use to look at various examples of micro-credentials. I've got 3 to share, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. I think you can read that pretty quickly. I won't go through it. So here is one from Australia. Ernst & Young have made their own badges. This is an example of an employer making their own micro-credentials. They're totally not related to higher education or credit. That's how they kind of span out on the micro-credentials. This one I'm going to put a link because it's hard to explain in a short time. This is from Deakin University, and this is actually certifying prior knowledge and skills for mature and expert learners. So I'll put information on the slides for you. And I thought I'd also give you an example of a coding bootcamp. This one's offered at Monash. Trilogy is a United States company. And again, that's how that one works out. I want to finish on this though, because I think this is interesting. I've just released this report on Coursera professional certificates and subset Google career certificates. When you've got a minute, go and have a look at this. Here are the 23 certificates. 21 of them are offered by companies. 2 of them are offered by universities. Look at the suggested hours in the first column. Those in red are less than 100 hours. The cost, those in red, next column, are less than $300. By the way, I'm using Australian currency. For experience, they're all, those that are published, the learner ratings are very high for some. Look at the numbers of enrolments. The Google IT support certificate has, at late September, nearly 400,000 enrollees. Doesn't mean they finished, but that's how many people have signed up. But look at the last column. Here is feedback from selected learners who actually have started a new career or got a pay rise or promotion based on that short, inexpensive online course. So I guess where I'm going to with that, I'm just going to move along, is if this is the new mindset in some fields, for some jobs, micro-credentials, regardless of credit, very few of those stack up for credit. Why do we need qualifications? What are the quality markers? And what about traditional providers? And this is my last slide. Here are some urgent challenges, and I'm very keen and already am working on these. And Simone is working with me. global high-level definitions. We need a universal definition. What's a micro-credential? What's a badge? So we can have conversations. We need some taxonomies and quality criteria in the report I mentioned. I suggest critical information surveys. I'll lead you to look at it. But finally, we need these these national ecosystems to be able to connect, because what learners of all ages across the lifespan need is for micro and macro credentials to be interoperable across borders, across lifespan, even time zones, folks, and we're in all of them now, and across sectors as well. So I hope I'm finishing on time, Michael. My email address is on the end slide there, and that's me done.
Thank you, Beverly. I thought that was very inspiring and very interesting. We have a few questions in the Q&A. I suggest that we go to South Africa now, but you can have a look at the Q&A questions, and then we'll return to these questions after the speakers are done. Is that fine? All right.
Yes, that's absolutely
so turning to South Africa, and probably also complementary to what we heard from Australia, I would now like to welcome Barbara Dale-Jones, who's the co-founder and director of the Field Institute, a global strategy and innovation consulting company. She's a specialist in education, advises on innovation projects, and passionate about driving an integrated digital ecosystem in South Africa. So without much further ado, I would like to say hello, Barbara. Hello, Johannesburg. And please share us your view on the topic of today.
Thanks very much, Michael. And it's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see?
Yes.
Okay.
All fine.
So to build on what Beverly has just spoken about, and to talk to micro-credentials and ecosystems, I'm going to talk about an exciting and very innovative project that is in its infancy in South Africa, which is looking at the post-school education and training system in South Africa. And looking at the ways in which data can be utilized and alternative forms of credentialing can occur. Just to explain what I mean by the post-school education and training system, this encompasses the higher education sector as well as the technical and vocational sector, and then also things like informal skills acquisition, work integrated learning, and all the different ways in which different skills and knowledge and competencies can be acquired by people. This project has been initiated by an organization, a non-profit organization in South Africa called Jet Education Services. The CEO of this company is on the call today, James Keevy, in association with the Manufacturing, Engineering and Related Services Sector Education and Training Authority, the MERSETA. So it's an important point to make that this is a public-private partnership at work here. And what's under development is a national digital and data ecosystem for effective skills planning and provisioning. It's intended that this should help the post-school education and training system align to the needs of the labor market and produce the right kind of skills for the labor market. And what it's intending for South African citizens is that they should have access to real-time data and information on post-school education and training, that they should utilize that data to make learning and career decisions, and that they should consequently be able to make informed labor market decisions that lead to jobs. Now, I said at the opening that this is a very innovative project, and there's some specific innovations that we're weaving into this. One is the idea of very dynamic and agile micro-credentialing. Another one is the idea of interoperability. Beverly spoke about that just now. So we'll be talking about the interoperability of credentialing, but also of data. And then the idea of a decentralized identity model is something that's fundamental to this project, and I'll talk about that just now. But first, just to talk a little bit about the theory of change, and here I've given you a small component to the theory of change. If you'd like to see the full theory of change, please go to the bit.ly link at the top of the screen there. But you'll see that there's bold and ambitious long-term outcomes here around the whole PSET system in South Africa being aligned to supply and demand needs of the labor market. And that ultimately the intention is that South African citizens should make informed labor market decisions that lead to increased employment. So there's an impact assumption here in the theory of change that links to our national development plan targets in order that employment can be driven in the country. And just to say that building on this idea of interoperability, we've gone out and we've done a whole lot of research about what's happening internationally. One of the early pieces of work on this project was an international review to inform the South African innovation. It's called Interoperable Data Ecosystems. Again, I offer you the bit.ly address here if you'd like to go and read about it. And I'll obviously, like Beverly, I'll share my slides in order that you can see this information. But just to go back and talk a little bit about the details of this project. Both public and private education institutions in South Africa are starting to explore the idea of digital credentialing. And they're also starting to explore the idea that dynamic and agile digital credentialing can occur. Obviously, the benefit of this would be that a data-rich ecosystem will develop, which will connect work opportunities and appropriately skilled individuals. And it will also allow for just-in-time pockets of learning that are relevant to the workplace to occur. Obviously, quality assurance is a concern nationally at this stage because the ability to regulate or map these kind of small, just-in-time pockets of learning that lie outside of traditional structures is effectively not possible at the moment within the current South African credentialing system. But what we're seeing is the rise of much smaller, much more agile, much more relevant and as needed learning opportunities for individuals to take. And alongside that, we're seeing the rise of interoperable data ecosystems. And the whole idea of interoperable data is that data ownership is shifted away from the sort of centralized authority towards the individual. And of course, historically, data has always belonged to education and training providers or quality assurance bodies or even relevant government departments. And that is in fact still the case in South Africa. So we've got traditional systems such as qualifications frameworks and conventions that tend to use data control. And what we're looking for in this project is an interoperable approach where there's a decentralized form of control and individual data ownership. And that obviously allows for benefits for individuals because they can have greater possibilities of porting their qualifications and their student data. So mobility and portability become more possible. Now, linked to the notion of the interoperable and the decentralized is the notion of self-sovereign identity, which is a principle that informs this innovation. Self-sovereign identity is a decentralized identity model. What we are, all of us, doesn't matter which country of the world we work in or live in, we are used to centralized identity models. So we all have passports, we have things like Instagram logins. These are issued to us by third parties that are owned by the third party. The data in these instances is not portable, but it's rather part of a larger data set, which is typically centrally owned, and of course, famously, often abused. And if you think, for example, of the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, that's a very powerful and potent example of that. Now, the principle of self-sovereign identity is that control over identity data shifts away from central authorities to the individual, and that individual's credentials become private, secure, and verifiable, and that the individual has agency and control over those. So what you see with SSI is a peer-to-peer data exchange where no one party controls the relationship with the other. So no longer is a government department, for example, or a quality assurance agency controlling data. Now, the principles and the technology of self-sovereign identity are very closely interlinked. things like the blockchain, a decentralized technology, have allowed for a solution here. So cryptography, distributed ledgers, the blockchain, they're all possible solutions for the problem that we've been trying to solve here, which is how do you take away from the need for a central authority, but how do you at the same time ensure safety and control? And the blockchain allows for exactly that. It provides digital watermarking, which confirms who issues the data, when the data was issued, and that the data has not been tampered with. So, sorry, I'm just ahead of myself. Before I get there, just to talk about and make this relevant to learning broadly. Why is self-sovereign identity relevant to learning? Well, what it allows learners to do is to prove securely, firstly, who they are, and secondly, what their educational credentials are. And they can do that to anybody at any time and at their own behest without having to pay for it or apply for it. So it gives individuals direct access to and control over the management of their credentials, but at the same time maintains the verifiability and the privacy of their data. This kind of approach and technology allows the benefits to span the entire student life cycle, including everything from registration right through to the issuing of transcripts and qualifications. And it allows for real mobility and portability across boundaries, across institutions, across systems. It also allows for the kind of reciprocal relationship between education and labor that this project is trying to achieve, and that, for example, we saw Beverly talking about Australia looking for, where labor can broadcast using this technology what its requirements are, and education can respond in a very agile and appropriate way. And finally, decentralized and digital credentials help students gain access to institutions of learning, demonstrate their qualifications, and ultimately secure a job. So
10 minutes are over. So 2
Thanks,
more minutes,
Michael.
Barbara.
Thank you. So what does this mean for the post-school education and training system in South Africa? Well, the opportunity exists for educational credentialing to change the nature of the relationship between individuals and their educational data. If this data is decentralized, individuals with digital identities will be able to take control over their identity records. And that will include all of the data related to education, training, skills, projects, job history, assessments. Something like recognition of prior learning suddenly becomes less important because that's part of what the credentialing will achieve. It allows data for verification and transactions without the need to rely on third-party institutions as central repositories. And ultimately, it allows individuals to turn their skills, training, and experience into genuine value in the labor market so that they can access better career and development opportunities. So just finally from me to say that another report is emerging out of this project right now that's looking at the state of readiness of the post-school education and training sector in South Africa for enhanced data interoperability and the kind of credentialing and decentralizing that I've been speaking about. Again, here's a bit.ly link. If you'd like to go to that link, you can ask for a copy of this, which is coming out this very week. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for sharing this very ambitious South African project. And I'm sure we'll come back to the question of self-sovereign identities later on in the discussion. Simone, I would like to introduce you now to the audience and to prepare for your contribution. You're currently the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Digitary, a company that developed and maintains MyEquals. I think Beverly already referred to MyEquals. It's a digital credential platform in use by all the public universities in Australia and New Zealand. And also your company, or the company you work for, was selected in 2020 to build the Canadian national network. So there's a lot of experience in the person of Simone that can contribute to the discussion, and he will focus this morning on some of the developments in Europe, and also for you, the same time budget has been allocated. So Simone, if you're ready, you can join us and start your presentation.
Thank you, Michael. With pleasure. As most of you know, GDN is very dear to my heart. And although it's a shame that we couldn't meet in person, I think technology allows us to really be in many places at once almost. So I come to you from Italy today, where I was born and raised and I live, but the work that we do at Digitary, as Michael said, really spans across regions. And in today's topic, just really focuses on the fact that while there is a pandemic going on today, there is another pandemic that is in the making, and it is the microcredentials pandemic, a positive one, albeit. So I'll share with you some elements of context and practice around what's happening in Europe. I also would like to take a different angle and look at a high level on what is the tech behind microcredentials, and also leave you with a few possibly provocative reflections at the end that may help us with the discussion. So let me just go into it. Lifelong learning is a matter of different learning experiences, whether they're macro or micro, as Beverly was pointing out. And there hasn't been a more interesting time to be in the educational space and to see this convergence or this reconciliation of micro and micro learning experiences. And then we could look at it from the angle of credentialing. So in a way, size doesn't really matter. And in fact, we are seeing the long tail of the learning experiences, of those micro learning experiences, becoming more and more prominent and recognized as they should be. If we look at the European Union, there is an interesting and unprecedented, I would argue, momentum around providing the political scaffolding for this new type of credentials to flower. And the several policies that have been already published and some in the makings really allow us to anchor the topic of today into Europe. And I wanted to share just a few highlights from important pieces of policies in Europe. One comes from the European education area, which is the frame under which we operate in Europe. So this is very important. And I'll just call out this European approach to microcredentials, which is an ongoing process, a consultative process that is really aimed at informing decision makers onto how to create fertile ground so that the evolution of learning and education could happen in Europe. Now, the European education area refers to a skills agenda in which the uptake of microcredentials is explicitly mentioned. Not only that, this goes to the extent of mentioning the connection of microcredentials with qualification frameworks, as well as two very important projects that are already visible and in place in Europe, being Europas and its digital credential infrastructure. There is clearly a lot of emphasis on the digital side of things. So the revolution or the pandemic around microcredentials is also a digital one. And all this is done really to support, I guess, at a wide, looking at it from a wide angle, the UNESCO Global Recognition Convention. Drilling down on the digital education part, there is an action plan where, again, emphasis is put on content tools and digital platforms to make up this European approach to microcredentials. So that, at a high level, is a flyover. What is the political context supporting microcredentials in Europe? I wanted to touch on a couple of more practical initiatives that are ongoing in Europe, being Europas and the European University Initiatives. Europas is really the new Europas. This is a flagship initiative of Europe, which many of you may be familiar with, which had a significant lift in July this year after many years of being let's say, revisited. And now it comes fully equipped with a digital credential infrastructure, which is really supporting micro-credentialing strategy. It is a complex platform that is made up of different moving parts that integrate into each other, but clearly the most important part for us, digitally, but for many in the ecosystem, is this consideration for open standard and the creation of this European digital credential infrastructure that really allows data exchange and recognition to happen in a more streamlined ways. European universities are a new construct of Europe that has been, has seen already its first round of funding and its first set of European universities, which are consortia that come together around different principles to create the future of universities in Europe. And very interestingly, there is mention of looking at possibly establishing a so-called European curriculum or even a European degree. So the collaboration in this particular initiative among universities is really tight, and it's unprecedented as well. And some of this first set of European universities have really put an emphasis on micro-credentials. One that I would mention is the ECIU. It's the European Consortium of Innovative Universities, where the theme of micro-credentials is really part of the action plan, and where the idea of picking a digital credential platform to support micro-credentials is a core element of it. I'd like to just shift a bit of focus onto the tech. Without going into too much details, digital credentials, which is something that at Digital we are very familiar with, are the way to recognize credentials nowadays. And it all really starts from technology that is already available, and it's been available for a while. I like to joke about this because I have a thing for open badges, but really this concept of recognition technologies goes back to several years ago. And I would argue that open badges are the ancestors of modern recognition technologies. And there's a pathway of stackable innovation in recognition technologies that does have a trajectory, but does start somewhere. So we need to make sure that the tech that we're looking at, that we're building, doesn't leave anyone behind. And so it's not just about making a leap from paper to blockchain, let's say, but it is about really making sure that the whole sector, and then the responsibility of vendors like Digital, for example, just bring everyone along the journey. So badges are really key element, I believe, of in supporting micro-credentialing strategies. And the other element is that open badges, like other form of recognition technologies, do need to be interoperable, as it was mentioned before, and comprehensive. Interoperable because there is a world of different technologies out there, and even standards, believe it or not, supporting digital credentials or learner records. And the trick here is not to just pick one over the others, but to build interoperability mechanisms so that we can really build the ecosystem together. And comprehensive means that these credentials or credentialing technologies need to be able to capture and signal both micro and macro learning experiences. And that is a reality, that's a fact. Even with open badges currently, this is very possible. And at the center of this is the learner. And so the idea of self-sovereignty that was mentioned by Barbara is very much present and not just future state. In giving you a couple of examples on what's already happening, I wanted to mention a couple of projects from two regions in the world where we operate. One is MyEquals. So MyEquals is the binational digital credential platform for all public universities in Australia and New Zealand. We were fortunate enough to be able to support this project. And I wanted to share with you that if we look at the way Australian universities are keep equipping themselves to support their micro-credentialing strategies, well, 1 in 3 of all Australian universities have already chosen open badges as the technology of choice to really support their micro-credentialing strategies. So I think this is big, this is a good signal, this is not future, this is what's happening today. And so that is very significant, and I wanted to share that with you. 2
more minutes, Simone.
DCU is a European example. Individual institutions, DCU has done great at really supporting the evolution of thinking around micro-credentials. In fact, Mark Brown has come up with this idea of a credential ecology. This probably ties back with the definition of micro-credentials, but it is a good metaphor to look at the ecosystem and a very powerful one. So we're happy to support DCU in their own pathway. And worth mentioning that DCU is one of the universities involved in the European University Consortium, ECIU, that I mentioned before. Now the reflections. One is around genomics. I was inspired by this from Mark on his idea of ecology. We're all familiar with the T-shaped person, where you want to have hard skills that are on the vertical axis and soft skills that those are transversal, and that makes up a T. I think micro-credentials do add another third dimension to a person, which is more context. So visually it would turn into a DNA helix, and context is very important, and micro-credentials do a great job at adding that dimension to individuals. The second one is this idea of a learning renaissance. Micro-credentials are not new. I mean, at some point in history, we divided formal and informal education, micro-credential and macro-credentials. I think this is the revolution, the renaissance, is being able to really look at lifelong learning through one lens and do away with the split. And so this is where micro-credential, I think, could help, being an integration point in lifelong learning. The third and last one is this idea of reframing the conversation. Recognition of micro-credential is inspiring work, political work around qualification frameworks and micro-credentialing frameworks. Although I would warn around not overemphasizing framing micro-credentials into frameworks, as this might inhibit the innovative power of micro-credentials. So while it's great to stack and make a comprehensive approach, recognition approach to credentialing, I would warn against not trying to still look at how many hours go into a unit of micro-credentials, but rather focus on outcomes. And this is not new in the conversations in education. So again, it's great to put a frame, but not inhibit innovation. And I'll just close by sharing with you that I think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg of micro-credentials. I talk about the pandemic initially, it's a good one. But the policies that are coming to support this are in place, the technology is there, and practice is really realizing that these micro-credentials need to be legitimately a new form of credentialing that makes up a comprehensive landscape for credentialing. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much. Michael, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Simone. We have a few questions that popped into the Q&A chat. I suggest that we answer and address them first. I have a few questions I want to ask the speakers myself, but I'll do that in a minute. First of all, two questions to Beverly on the purpose of, or the juxtaposition of assessed learning next to less than a formal qualification. Just a question on the definition, or how the AQF, the Australian Qualification Frameworks, defines assessed learning.
So thank you, good question. Now, the point is that assessment in micro-credentials can go from extremely tiny to very complex. There is no actual rigor around what the assessment needs to be. Whereas for a qualification, those standards are much more set down. So this is one of the policy pieces of work that needs to be done. And quite frankly, I can tell you what I would like it to be, but the Australian government hasn't moved on yet to actually spell that out. So that's a piece of work that's slated for 2021. Once we've digested the AQF review and we see what's happening in the micro-credential world, then it will go to a piece of work to be done on stipulating what the standards are when a micro-credential is considered credit-bearing. I think if it's not credit-bearing, people are not too worried. But when it becomes credit-bearing, that means it's going to interact with the AQF. So I'm sorry, that's a long way of saying we don't know the answer yet. I mean, I know what I'd like it to be, but we as a country haven't specified that yet.
Okay, that also refers a little bit to the QA models that are being explored, right?
Yes, that's right. The
Okay.
QA is not set out yet.
So, I mean, that was a second question by James Keevy. He would like to hear more on the QA models in New Zealand, Australia to accommodate digital credentials and formal qualifications frameworks. So,
well, Australia and New Zealand are both part of my equals, but you know, Simone is better to answer that question than me. And also, I'm not an expert on what New Zealand is doing. I know it's, you know, counterintuitive, but we're different countries, even though we do talk to them a lot, obviously. And I know they've taken a very different view, but clearly in this country, the regulatory approach has not yet caught up with what micro-credentials are doing. There's just a lot of waiting and seeing.
Yeah, this was actually, before turning to Simone, my question to all of you, I mean, at least for the South African, Australian example, but also to some extent the European, to what, when we develop an ecosystem, how do we ensure that it's compatible and connected to systems that we created before, the qualifications frameworks being the most noteworthy example? They need to be interrelated and communicating. I mean, I can imagine that the digital ecosystem will deliver a type of service, but it can't ignore that a formal qualifications framework exists, and it shouldn't probably also not undermine such a system. So I'll be wondering for all three speakers how they see their view on the interrelationship with what existed or what developed over the years in terms of a qualifications framework, and how this interrelates to micro-credentials and the ecosystem that is now emerging.
I might just answer quickly, Michael, in that the AQF review that came out actually suggested and recommended quite a different approach from what we have already, where we would have bands, skills, and more elasticity across different levels in the AQF. So whatever we had before, which was probably easier to line up with other national systems, is probably going to be less easy to exactly quantify things now. However, we do have through ICED those international agreements on what we mean by the levels of master, bachelor, and so on. So I do think some of the work's been done for us, but I'll let the other speakers answer.
Simone, would you
if
like
I may,
to go next?
I have sometimes a radical view on this, and maybe not very popular, but I'm less concerned around connecting and comparing qualification frameworks, and I'm more interested in drilling down into the data and skills-based everything. When it comes to credentials, digital credentials allow us to really connect the signaling or the issuing of a credential to competence frameworks that already exist, so without having to reinvent the wheel. And through that, being able to double click, let's say, on that skill and access labor market information, including job openings, and thereby creating that ecosystem, that connected ecosystem that I would really argue it's what we're after, rather than having to measure the weight of where qualifications compare to each other. There's clearly a lot of work being done in the past, and a lot of framing and reframing around that. But I would say with the real power of micro-credential and digital micro-credentials really sits just by going toward the quantum of the credential. So just the smaller in this case is better.
Yes, well, I can see that, but just to drill down on that question, I mean, the national frameworks, they exist, and they have defined learning outcomes, and so it doesn't, to me, it doesn't really make sense to start developing something new, but it should at least relate to the, I mean, it's not so much about maybe comparing between countries on the qualifications framework level, but it's definitely about trying to align what is being developed to a national, or to a, for instance, in the European case, to a European framework. But the skills frameworks, to develop them new and not have them related or articulated in the language use and qualifications frameworks, would seem like a double work, no?
Well, qualification frameworks are an aggregation of to meet skills. So learning outcomes are the granular atomic element of qualifications. It should be. It's more outcome based. I know we're not there yet. We're struggling, and we will be struggling if we continue to just focus on that. So I think there is an opportunity through using linked data, if we want me to speak in tech terms, to just make sure that we build, at infrastructure level, those connections, and not just at policy level or after the fact. But again, I share this as a personal view.
No, of course. It's also a personal view, just asking a question, but turning to South Africa, maybe your view on this. And then Barbara, we have 2 more questions in the Q&A chat that also are addressed to you, but maybe.
Thank you. I mean, I think how I would build on from what Simone has just said is partly answer to one of Herman's questions, which is that I think in the principles that informed the development of the National Qualifications Framework in South Africa originally was the idea of the portability and mobility of learning. So there's always been the understanding that any kind of learning pathway can be made up of a number of building blocks that can be put together in different ways. The problem is that the system has become very bureaucratic and rather difficult to ensure a kind of an agility of movement and addition within what was a very different kind of principle initially. And so about Herman's question, which is how does something like the South African Qualifications Authority cope with the idea of micro-credentialing? As I said earlier, it can't really regulate or map these sort of small just-in-time pockets of learning that lie outside the traditional structures. So we've got a bit of a quality assurance struggle at the moment, because if something's not leading to something that's actually registered on the National Qualifications Framework, it essentially falls outside of the aegis of the quality assurance bodies. And we don't yet know it, it's not being regulated yet, which leads obviously to some kind of inconsistencies in provision. And then if I may just answer his other question about the Southern African region, the SADC region, I don't think there's other examples of this happening in the SADC region. I think it's an exciting possibility for the SADC region for this to be broadly taken up regionally rather than just in South Africa. And there is precedent in South Africa, at least in Africa for this. The East African community is operating in a very coordinated fashion in this way. We wrote about it in our international review, but there is portability and mobility of learning occurring across East African countries.
Okay, thank you very much. I see in the chat that also James Keevy wrote some aspects on the topic of qualification frameworks and the role of learning outcomes. I suggest that those interested read in the chat and see his points. I think they're very relevant to the discussion here. I have 2 more questions. We're only almost at the end of the time, but I would like to pick up the question of a global definition of microcredentials. Can we agree on something? And I think it was you, Beverly, who said the key in Australia is the question of assessment. Would that be something that the 3 of you would be agreeing to, that a microcredential always has to be an assessed piece of learning?
Can I just qualify that before Barbara and Simone jump in?
Please.
Which is, I think when it is going to be credit bearing, to go back to Barbara's previous point now, some things will sit outside and unrelated to the formal qualification. When they're going to interact, then standards and assessment have to apply. I thought long and hard about that when I came up with that definition as to whether assessment needs to be in even a freestanding micro-credential. I think it does, because at its heart, it's a certification that someone has demonstrated they can do something. So just to turn up and participate, like turning up to this webinar, I think that's participation. Maybe we can have participation micro-credentials, but I think that just muddies the waters. But I'll leave the others to have an answer.
Thank you. Barbara?
Yeah, I just see a question in the chat about South African Qualifications Authority and global mobility. I'm not sure who the person is who's asked the question, but I can't really provide the kind of response from SAQA's point of view, except again to reiterate the point that there is I think the vision we're offering in the PSET Cloud project is the idea that there can be something that's much less bureaucratic, much more responsive, and much more aligned across boundaries of institutions and countries. So that this kind of verification challenge is mitigated and some of the pain points are removed.
Okay, but the question on assessment, Barbara, would that be a central element of any definition of micro-credentials for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I'd prefer a more sort of a radical view of the idea that a demonstrable, assessment should not be something that prevents there from being credentialing. Now, obviously, someone has to demonstrate their capacity to know something or be able to do it. But I'm not sure that formal assessment is necessarily the right way to achieve that, and could become a blockage in the system, as we've seen it in many systems. So yeah. I think I would argue for something more radical in the way that Simone did.
A radical or more open view on what assessment means. Okay, Simone?
Well, it's hard to find something that in a few years may not even be called the way we call it right now, micro-credentials. The term may disappear because it will go mainstream and we will no longer make that distinction, just like we broke up just the education sector in the past. I'd say that if we look at today, the initial emergence of digital credentials supporting what we call micro-credentials was really an approach to evidence-based learning. And it was just making sure that there was a claim connected to some supporting evidence around a specific skill. And so whether that is a self-assessed skill, and I take that is a possibility that comes with evidence supporting it, I think that flips the coin a little bit. And the technology that we have available right now allow for that kind of signaling that is complemented by evidence and that is connected to competence frameworks. So to me, rather than spending too much time on what is the definition of this, which could be fluid and change over time, I think it's interesting to look at the different the aspects of what this micro-credentialing strategies make available with the support of available technology today.
Okay, thank you. Maybe the question of definition is indeed a bit misleading. Maybe we should talk about guiding principles, at least so that we can understand what each other and have a common view on what we are really talking about. But I guess that's also part of being on the tip of the iceberg, as you said. This is something that is fluid and developing. I would like to wrap up this webinar now with some of the key messages I take home. I already focused on the question of definition, on the assessment and how to view that. I think it's there are interesting developments in terms of this focus on graduate employability and the fact that the connection that was drawn to what we experience now with COVID and the labor market impact it might have, and that the need for further qualifications will and lifelong learning is most likely to take off. I mean, I've been discussing lifelong learning policies for a number of years now, and 10 years ago we had the feeling that lifelong learning is now really going to take off, and it at least in Germany it hasn't really had the impact as we were kind of looking at. So my hope would be, of course, that micro-credentials can fulfill this role, at least in certain sectors. I think that's what from Beverly I took from your presentation, that the question is, where will microcredentials really play a role as an alternative or an additional system next to real or formal qualifications. I can still imagine this happening in the tech world very much. The question to me would also be how do licensed professions, for instance, fit in here? Because they're maybe only for further qualification of certain degrees. Medical doctors, for instance, I can't imagine that medical doctors would stack up microcredentials before they become a physician, but I can imagine that they would do their further qualification to stay abreast of current literature and so on through this type of mechanism. We didn't talk about the mode of delivery. I wanted to ask you that question, but I can't. But there's an assumption, I think, that microcredentials always have to take place online. It'd be interesting also to see whether there are other modes of delivery used. Maybe that's something for a later panel. And one part that that goes through it, for the benefit of the learner, we need to have a trustworthy system. And this is something as a layer that encompasses everything we do. It will only work if those that use it trust what is being done. So the providers, but also those that accept the learners because of their skills, and in the end also the learners themselves, because they need to have something in hand that is worth what they invested in time, in money, and so on. So this creating trust brings us to the point that we always need to have systems that communicate and that interrelate and work together. And even if we are innovative, we need to take into account the path we come from. So with that having said, I hope we can leave everyone 7 minutes late in time, but I would like to thank all the speakers. It was tremendously exciting to listen to you from Australia, from South Africa, from Italy. And I hope to see you all in real time at some point to continue this type of conversation over a glass of beer or wine or apple juice. Thank you very much, and have a tremendously good night or great day if you, depending on where you are on the planet. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.